Good morning, guys. So today we're going to start on ancient Egypt, and I've got my little buddy Brock here with me, and of course my coffee. Thank God Starbucks is still open. So what I've done for this lecture is I've broken ancient Egypt down into two parts. Again, it's a long lecture, kind of like Mesopotamia, but since we're starting with the whole thing, I thought I'd break it down into two. So this is going to be part one, and then you'll see also part two in the module. So Brock, you want to go? I'm going to let you down. Okay, all right. So we've been talking about Mesopotamia as the area of the very first civilization, with Sumer being the very first civilization. And then we talked about how it's a collection of these city-states. Well, Egypt is very different, and you can see here the time frame for ancient Egypt, 3100 to 31 BC. That time frame makes it the longest lived civilization. So for approximately that entire time period, they were unified as one group of people. They didn't have this breakout of all of these different city-states like Mesopotamia does. So Egypt is also the example of the world's first state. And what I mean here is that it had one legal and political authority. Now, you guys are probably familiar with the term pharaoh. That's not actually a term that the Egyptians used until the 18th dynasty. It's kind of a bastardization of the term which means great house, and I got into the Hebrew Bible. So they actually used the term ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But so these are the two things, again, about Egypt, is it's the longest lived civilization we have here in the Middle East, and it's the world's first state. Now, a lot of that had to do with their geography. So let's take a look at the geography of Egypt. So here's a collection of maps. So again, we talked about the geography of Mesopotamia and how that tied into the development of the state. So same thing here. So if you notice on the map to the left, Egypt is surrounded by deserts on three sides. You've got the Western Desert over on the left. You've got the Nubian Desert in the south. You've got the Eastern Desert to the east or the right-hand side. So that effectively isolated them from invasion. And then as you move toward Israel, you can see you've got the Sinai Peninsula, and it's all desert. So very difficult, even up to World War II, when the Germans tried to invade, trying to get any sort of troops across this vast desert expanse is virtually impossible. So that was one thing that helped them out. Another thing, if you look at the map by my picture, the British Museum map, you can see that they were rich in natural resources: gold, alabaster, limestone, natron, amethyst, all that kind of stuff. So they were relatively self-sufficient in terms of these kind of prestige items, lots of building materials. The one thing they didn't have was wood, a lot of wood, so they would have to export or import some of that. But for the most part, they didn't need to trade extensively outside of their borders if they didn't want to. Then you notice on the north, we've got the Mediterranean coast. And then to, again, the east, you've got the Red Sea. So these bodies of water also provided some insulation and protection. So on the Red Sea, the only place that you could anchor a ship is at Hurghada. So you see that on the map. And today, that's a great place. People will go there to snorkel, that in Sharm el-Sheikh there in the Sinai Peninsula. But when you have just one area where somebody could drop a ship, that's very easy to control. Same thing up in the Mediterranean. So that area with Alexandria, Rosetta, that area, that's known as the Delta region. So again, that's where you can drop anchor, but it's a small area, easily controlled. So they didn't have to worry about major invasion. All right, so we've got deserts. Another thing, though, is that we have to remember the critical nature of the Nile itself. So Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile because without the Nile, life, let alone civilization, would not have been possible here. They get less rainfall than we do here in the Phoenix and Tucson region, so you can imagine very dry. So when we think about our models for state development, and remember that hydraulic model, that might play in nicely here. So let's take a look at the next picture. So again, this is kind of a close-up of the Nile. So the Nile starts down at Lake Victoria, down in Tanzania, and then it's interesting because it flows from south to north. Most rivers flow the other way, but it flows from south to north, eventually emptying out in that delta region. But we've got about 700 miles of the Nile itself that belong to Egypt. And by the time it gets into Egypt, it has gone through a series of what are called cataracts. And the picture in the lower right-hand corner is a picture of one of these cataract areas. So think of them kind of like white water rapids. So number one, they're going to slow down the water considerably. So by the time the Nile gets to Egypt, it's very slow and sluggish, unlike what we see in Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates that can flood uncontrollably. But the other thing is that it is, again, very difficult, virtually impossible to get any sort of warship through these cataracts. So they were protected by that. They didn't have to worry about any invasion along the Nile there. Now this word inundation up here in the top right-hand corner, that refers to the flooding of the Nile that would happen. And when it retreated, it would leave this nice, rich, thick silt. And that's where they would grow their crops. I'm going to go back a slide for a minute. I guess I can't. Okay, I can't go backwards. But I wanted to show you how it appears that Egypt is one long oasis. You've got between 3 and 13 miles on either side of the Nile where you can grow your crops. Then you hit the desert. So when you think about kind of like that circumscription theory where people are hemmed in, that's another model that fits nicely there. So let's go on. So again, because of this geography, they were isolated both physically and culturally for millennia, but the problem is they became very ethnocentric and nationalistic. The Egyptians had two words for people. There were Egyptians and there were everybody else, because if you weren't Egyptians, you really didn't matter to anybody. One cultural concept that the Egyptians had was the concept of duality, D-U-A-L-I-T-Y, duality, this or that, day or night, black or white, good versus evil. And they did that also in their geography. So they split Egypt into Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. But the trick to remember is that their Lower Egypt is in the north. It's this delta region right here, basically to Memphis. And then from Memphis all the way down to basically Aswan, that is Upper Egypt, because again, the Nile flows north. So there is Lower Egypt and there were Upper Egypt. And in the time period before Egypt becomes a state, there are what we would recognize as city-states in each of these areas, and it's going to be Upper Egypt that wins out. So Egyptian chronology is broken into dynasties and then larger time periods. I'm not going to expect you to memorize the dynasties. What I'm going to want you to know are the highlights of each of these time periods. But let's take a look at how the chronology is broken down. So first of all, we have a time period before Egypt was a state. This is the pre-dynastic, or sometimes called the proto-dynastic, and it's labeled Dynasty 0 because archaeologists found evidence of this time period after the historians had already labeled the dynasties. So they weren't going to go back and relabel the dynasties, so they just made it a Dynasty 0. So the pre-dynastic kind of equates to the Neolithic, the agricultural revolution. Then once we have unification, what we're going to see is Upper and Lower Egypt are unified. We go into a time period known as the Early Dynastic, and that's Dynasties 1 and 2. Then we'll talk about the Old Kingdom, which is Dynasties 3 through 6. And this is the time period that the pyramids are being built. So it's a prosperous time for Egypt. But then unfortunately, we're going to see a time period of political, economic, and social collapse, kind of like a recession, but this is a recession on steroids because it lasts a long time. So these are called intermediate periods, and this is when, again, that state, that one legal authority is broken up, and we see kind of a return to a collection of city-states. And this is Dynasties 7 through 10. We then reunify, and we have what's known as the Middle Kingdom, dynasties 11 through 12. Now we have another breakdown, and the second intermediate period we'll spend a couple minutes on because something interesting and important for the Egyptians happened during this time period. Then we will see, again, reunification into a period known as the New Kingdom. So for those of you who are interested in King Tut, for example, he belongs to this time period. So this is dynasties 18 through 20. And again, this is going to be an interesting time period because this is the first time we're going to see Egypt acting as an empire. And remember, we talked about the difference between just a civilization and an empire where you're conquering other lands. We then have a third intermediate period. We're really not going to talk about that. And then there are the late periods. This is the time period that the Greeks and the Persians and the Romans, they come in. We're not going to talk about that either. So really we're going to be interested in everything up to the New Kingdom time period. And then we will talk about their religion, things like that. All right, so these are our time periods. Again, we're going to go through, we're going to start with the pre-dynastic, and we're going to see what's going on in these time periods. So, pre-dynastic, this is a time period prior to unification. And again, this is a time period that food production begins to appear in the Nile River Valley. So it first appears up in the Delta region about 5000 BC. So remember that we have food production as early as 9000 BC. So it takes about 4000 years for it to get over to Egypt. That's how kind of backwater they were in the time period. So 5000 BC, it first shows up. It makes its way into Upper Egypt, remember the southern part of the country, around 4400 BC. So this is what pre-dynastic Egypt looked like. So very simple farming settlements consisting of these clusters of huts. Most of what we know about the pre-dynastic time period come from their burials. So during this time period, they were burying in what we call pit graves. Now you can see the picture in the upper right-hand corner. This is a pit grave. Simply that. They would go out into the desert floor, they would dig a shallow pit, they would put the body in. Now notice, the body is in the fetal position. Okay, so we already see that kind of ideological belief as early as the pre-dynastic. And also notice what is with them. Pottery, grave goods. And we know that grave goods suggest a belief in the afterlife. So we can see that as early as the pre-dynastic, we have this concept of an afterlife and grave goods. Around 4000 BC, what we see between Upper and Lower Egypt is this collection of, in Mesopotamia, what we would call city-states. Here they are called nomes. And again, these are kind of these little individual political units, each with their own little petty ruler. There are 42 of them in the entire land, and you can see the map here of where they all are. There's a couple more in Upper Egypt than there is in Lower Egypt. And we begin to see several important centers emerging. So Upper Egypt was known for manufacturing centers. Lower Egypt were the merchants, kind of the middlemen, who would then take those goods and trade them out up into Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. So remember that the term nome is synonymous with a city-state, but we call them, in Egypt, we call them nomes. And this is not like your little garden gnome. There's no G there. So one of the things that the Egyptians were creating was pottery. They were really known for their pottery industry. So this is typical pre-dynastic pottery, nicely decorated. So what we have here are these geometric forms of people. And then you see this kind of curved thing with what look like tentacles. Those are actually oars. This is a boat, and those two square things that the people are standing on, those are the cabins. So what this tells us is that as early as the pre-dynastic, the Egyptians were using boats to travel on the Nile. And then you can see in the background the mountains. And then look at the female on the left-hand side with her arms up over her head like this. So she might just be doing this, but there's also some suggestion that those might be emulating the horns of a cow. So keep that in mind, and hopefully I'll remember to tell you about that again. This is one of my favorite bowls, and if we were in class right now, I would go up and I would scritch its little belly there. So it's so cute, this little anthropomorphic bowl with these feet. But again, this is to show you what a developed craft industry they had. Here's, they were great in working in stone. This is a little stone vessel in the shape of a frog. You can hold it in your hand, and it would have had perfume in the little depression. Ivory. They love to use ivory, and these are all hair picks and combs, things to do your hair with. Again, these are prestige items, right? Because the average person is not going to have access to these or really a need for these. So we already know, again, in the pre-dynastic, we have people who are probably controlling the surplus, these kind of big men, right? The leaders of these nomes who can have these prestige items. We also have these slate cosmetic palettes, and unfortunately I have a replica of one, but if we ever get back in the classroom, I can show it to you. But for now, you're going to have to deal with these pictures. So the circle in the middle there is where you would grind up your makeup, the ochre or the charcoal coal for your eyes, things like that. But again, look at the detail on these things. So not only are they functional, but they're very aesthetic, and you have this craft industry. You've got people who can sit around and carve these very intricate cosmetic palettes while somebody else is working the field for them. All right, so unification of Egypt. I want to go, I can't go back, but one thing I wanted to tell you about the burials. I thought I had a picture of it, but apparently I don't. Maybe she'll pop up later on. But something that we see in these pre-dynastic burials is that they are removing the internal organs of the individual, and they are putting them in linen bags and mummifying them. So mummification, the practice of intentional mummification, as we're going to see, dates all the way back to the pre-dynastic time period. And this was shocking to archaeologists. You know, I think we're going to see it later on, but we'll talk about it in a second. So anyway, it was shocking to archaeologists because we thought it belonged to a much later time period. So now I remember, I think I do have a picture later on. So let's go through the unification of Egypt, and I think that'll pop up. So unification of Egypt. We've got Upper Egypt, we've got Lower Egypt, we've got these 42 nomes, each with their own little ruler. We've got to get from that to the world's first state. So how do we do this? Well, there's a two-step process, and we're going to talk about them individually. So step one begins around 3200 BC. Okay, so remember, unification of Egypt. Step one, about 3200 BC. And it begins at one of the nomes in Upper Egypt known as Abydos. Okay, so Abydos is a very important pre-dynastic site, and then goes on to be an important site later on. It will be a cult center for the god Osiris, but we are more interested right now in the pre-dynastic time period of Abydos. So what we have found at Abydos is this mace head. So a mace, M-A-C-E, is a war club. But in ancient Egypt, it was also a sign of kingship. So we found this mace head, and you can see that it has an individual here with a crown on, and he's holding what appears to be a hoe, H-O-E, a hoe, an agricultural implement. So here is a drawing of that mace head. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Now in Egyptian art, the largest person is typically the king. So we've got this guy. He's got what appears to be a crown on his head, but it kind of looks like a bowling pin. And this is the white crown of Upper Egypt. We recognize it. And it appears that he is using this agricultural implement to break ground, probably for an irrigation system. So you go, oh, the irrigation theory, right. Those who control the water are the most powerful, because you see the irrigation system below him. Now, above him, you see a bunch of poles with animals hanging off of them. So those are a type of bird. It's known as a lapwing bird. Lapwing, a lapwing bird. This is a symbol of a conquered people. And then each of the different designs on top of these poles, we think these poles are standards. Remember the standard of Ur, these things you carry into battle? And that each of these represent a different nome in Upper Egypt. And so what we think that this picture was of a king, one of the nomes, rulers, showing off that he had conquered and now controlled the other nomes. Now, what is his name? Well, if you look by his face, you see that little rosette design. So much like the dinger in cuneiform, this little rosette indicates the name of a king. And then you see next to him, there's a little scorpion. This is King Scorpion. So for a long time, when people found this, they thought that Scorpion was mythological, because the Egyptians talk about a line of kings, mythological kings, who existed before the physical kings. So everybody thought, okay, this is just part of their mythology. Until they found this. So again, we're still at Abydos. This is the largest pre-dynastic tomb we have, and it's labeled Tomb U-J. So you can see it's multi-chambered, mud brick, and then you see this collection of pottery right here. So let's take a look at this slide. So there's a close-up of that picture of the pottery. And then we found, so this pottery is from Syria, Palestine, so it's imported. Obviously a wealthy individual to have all this stuff coming in from Syria, Palestine. Then we found locally made pottery with these little ivory tags on them. So the German archaeologist Gunther Dreyer, who's working here, has argued that these tags represent symbols of different nomes. These are the conquered nomes who are giving tribute to the individual who owns this tomb. So that supports this idea now of, wow, perhaps Scorpion, as we'll see, is a real person, a real king, that he conquered these gnomes, but also these little ivory tags. They've suggested that this might be language, writing, and if so, it actually predates cuneiform. And if they ever agree to that, the entire archaeological community, we're going to have to throw cuneiform out as the earliest writing, but for the moment we're going to stick with cuneiform. We've also found in the tomb this thing over here on the left. So I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this is a Wa, W-A-S, a Wa scepter. It's a sign of kingship. You can see one of the gods here. This is the god Set. He is holding it. So again, the sign of kingship. On the pottery, we have also found the sign of the scorpion. So we believe that tomb U-J belongs to King Scorpion and that he was a real individual. Near the site of Abydos, out in the desert, there's some rocks that rock carvings were found on, and that's what this picture is up in the right-hand corner. And it shows, you can see here, a bound captive, scorpion, falcon, which may be our god Horus that we'll see in a minute. And all of this suggests that what may have happened, who may have made these rock carvings, are soldiers who were part of Scorpion's fighting force, and they're sitting out there in the desert and they're kind of bored, and they begin to scratch on the walls, this kind of scene about what they're engaged in. So we take a lot of this together and we're starting to see a picture of this real individual. So what we would say today is that in step one of unification, King Scorpion, from the nome of Abydos, unified the nomes of Upper Egypt. Okay? There were 22 nomes in Upper Egypt that he unified, and now he controlled all of them. This sets the stage for step 2 of unification, and that is to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. And so the date for this is approximately 3100 BC. So for this, we move to another nome that is south of Abydos, and this is the site of Hierakonpolis. The Egyptian word is Nekhen, but the Greek word is Hierakonpolis. This is a city of the falcon, and this city is sacred to the god Horus, Horus. We will meet him again, but you see 2 images of him here. So Hierakonpolis is an incredibly important pre-dynastic royal residence, but it's also an industrial complex and a religious center. So let's take a look at it. So here are images of the settlement itself, and we have clear class distinction based on the different housing types. We've got some really nice villas, multi-roomed, with nice garden courtyards and things like that. Most were these mud brick kind of semi-subterranean homes, but again, we do have some villas that suggest we have a wealthy class going on here. But the real difference in wealth and status is seen in the burials, in the cemeteries that we have at the site. We have what appears to be a working class cemetery and also an elite cemetery. So let's start with the working class cemetery. So here's the picture that I thought I was missing, but here she is. So over at the working class cemetery, we have a nice collection of individuals, and it shows us that for the most part, they were healthy, well-nourished. Average lifespan, though, wasn't that long. It was between 25 and 35 years. So shorter lifespan than we're used to, but again, healthy and well-nourished. What they were doing now is they were burying their dead still in these pit graves, but now you notice that she, and this is a she, is lying on a linen mat. So they would put a mat down, put the body, again, in the fetal position on the mat, cover it with another mat, and then cover that, probably in the hopes of keeping animals away from it. We have found also, and this is where we see the first evidence of mummification. So this young lady is named Ginger because she's got some scraps of hair, and it shows that the hair was red, probably dyed, but still, so we called her Ginger. But this is where the internal organs were removed, soaked in a resin-like material, wrapped up and returned to the body. So we have evidence here of this intentional practice of mummification. So if I were to ask you on an exam, what time period does mummification date to? You would say the pre-dynastic. Over in the elite cemetery, we've got a couple other things. What you're looking at here are the first funerary masks. So if you think about the mask of King Tut that covered his mummy, that's what we're talking about. Here, we've got some very simple ones, but you got to start somewhere. So we've got funerary masks. So this practice, and again, it belongs only to the elite. We also have scraps of papyrus paper found here. So earliest papyrus paper. And if you say, well, if we have paper, what are we doing with paper? Yeah, probably writing. So you begin to connect the dots here. We also have these mace heads. And again, remember, mace heads are a sign of kingship. So all of this suggests over here at Hierakonpolis that we have, again, another series of rulers that are probably now dependent on Scorpion from Abydos, but we'll see who that is in a minute. So I told you that the site, in addition to being this residence, was also an industrial complex, and they were creating 2 things on an industrial scale. One thing was pottery. So they were making 2 types of pottery. They were making kind of a rough, everyday pottery, but then they were also making a really nice, fine pottery that was only to go into burials. So if you make something that's going to go immediately out of distribution, that's pretty high value. So again, they were probably controlling the production of this pottery, and whomever controlled this industry had a lot of economic power and was controlling, the surplus, right? So pottery Here are some of the examples of the pottery coming out of Hierakonpolis, and there you see our goddess on the left-hand side. And again, if you think back to our Venus figurines, you could argue that we still see a lot of those same attributes here. And again, her arms up over her head, suggesting perhaps horns of a cow. Keep that in mind. Okay. Here's another piece of pottery. I love it because it's got the little hippopotamus that would be on the banks of the Nile here. So again, really nice, elegant stuff for a certain class of citizens. Okay. So pottery. The other thing they were making on an industrial scale was beer. They were brewing a ton of beer a day. They were brewing about 300 gallons of beer a day. And that was rations for about 200 people. So you can do the math there and figure out how much beer these people are drinking. But remember, as we talked about in class, it's a lower alcoholic content and it's really thick like a milkshake. But here you can see the vats and a drawing of what this kind of stuff would have looked like. So we've got this pre-dynastic royal residence. We've got this industrial complex with a lot of economic power. And then we have one of the earliest religious centers here. So again, we believe that this site was sacred to the god Horus. He is a falcon-headed god. And this is what we believe was the temple complex. And what you're looking at here is a 130-foot kind of oval courtyard in front of what we believe would have been the temple. So the temple had wooden poles and it had woven reed mats for the sides. So the temple itself is gone, but the post holes and some pictures of it in hieroglyphs still remain. And then on the left there are those kind of platforms where perhaps the cult statues would have resided and stood as they watched what was going on. We have found hundreds of wild animals that were sacrificed. And you wonder, why are they doing that? Well, let's go back to that concept of duality. And the Egyptians had a very strong belief in this idea of cosmic order. Cosmic order is personified by the goddess Ma'at. And that's M-A apostrophe A-T, Ma'at. And she's a goddess with a feather on top of her head. So Ma'at, this cosmic order, this is what the king is tasked with doing. He must maintain Ma'at, or cosmic order. Now, what's the opposite of order? Chaos. And we're going to see that chaos is personified by a god known as Set, S-E-T or S-E-T-H, Set. Right? So again, this duality. Well, one way to control chaos is to basically kill it. And that's what we think that these animals, the sacrifice of these wild animals, is again trying to get a control of the natural chaos of the world. So an amazing find here near this this religious complex is this thing, the Narmer pallet. So this guy is really big. I have a replica of him that I will show you guys later on. But it's about 2 feet long. This is a ceremonial cosmetic palette. It was never actually in use, but it was found in the foundations of this temple complex. So it was probably put there as a gift to the gods. So it's called the Narmer palette because this is the name of the guy on it. You can see the front of it is on the right side of your screen, and then the back is on the left. So in the next slide, we see an actual drawing of it. Now here's where I want to kind of go through the scenes. So let's look at the image on the left side. That's the front side of it. And on both sides, you see what appears to be the head of a cow on the top. Now we're back to that image of the goddess, right? So what we have here is the goddess Hathor. H-A-T-H-O-R. H-A-T-H-O-R. Hathor. She is a cow-headed goddess. It is her job to suckle the newborn king, but also to nourish the king as he travels the gates to get into the afterlife or the underworld. Now, we believe that the cult of Hathor goes back to pre-dynastic times. We have some old pre-dynastic sites out in the desert that suggest they were worshiping cows. And that's where that Nile goddess may come from, is that she might be an early image of this cow goddess. So we have that image there. Then in between the cow heads, you see what, and I'll tell you what it is. It's a catfish and a chisel. These are hieroglyphs for the name, Nar-Mer, King Nar-Mer or King Catfish. Then we begin to see rows or registers of scenes. And again, we're still working on the left-hand side. So you see the largest image there is the king himself. He's wearing a certain crown. This is the red crown of Lower Egypt. And you can see before him are standards, probably standards of the nomes that he has now conquered. And then you see all of the headless bodies there, and their heads are actually placed between their legs. Then the next register has these two intertwined creatures. This is not typical Egyptian art. This is more Mesopotamian art, so it does suggest some influence from the Sumerians, that time period. But the intertwining of the two animals suggests the unification of the two lands. And then down on the bottom, you see what appears to be a bull, and that is Nar-Mer in the form of a bull, and with his head he's breaking through a wall of a city, and then he's also, the scene there is that he's preparing to, shall we say, violate that individual. So battlefield rape is another way of emasculating someone. So that occurred often in the ancient world, probably still in the modern world, unfortunately, too. So on the right side, which is the back side, we now see Nar-Mer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And he's got somebody by the top knot, and he's preparing to, what we say, smite. So he's got his mace in his hand, and he's going to smite. He's going to bash him on top of the head. And this is a common scene we will see kings in. And then you see what appears to be kind of a plant with a head on it. On top of it is a falcon. So that plant is a personification of the papyrus plant, so the personification of the symbol of the land. And Horus is the falcon there. So Horus is going to protect the king, and he's got the guy by the nose, hooked into the nose. And again, that's a concept of a conquered people. So where are we going with this? Archaeologists believe that this stone tablet is one of the earliest historical documents we have. Dating to about 3100 BC, we believe that it commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Nar-Mer, who lived in Hierakonpolis. And there's some suggestions that Nar-Mer may have been Scorpion's son. So, what we're seeing here, let's review. Step one is that King Scorpion from Abydos unifies the nomes of Upper Egypt. We now have a nice strong fighting force. He passes the charge on to his son, Nar-Mer from Hierakonpolis, who in step two, around 3100 BC, takes over Lower Egypt, unifying the two lands. Now, a lot of this was probably to cut out the middleman. So remember that Upper Egypt had all these industrial centers. In order to get their goods into Lower Egypt or even further on, they had to go through Lower Egypt. So what do you want to do? You want to cut out the middleman, and now you control all of the trade routes. So that's possibly the reason for it. Here we have the early dynastic now. So in 3100 BC, when Nar-Mer unifies Upper and Lower Egypt, this opens up a time period known as the early dynastic. So Nar-Mer is the founder of the early dynastic period around 3100 BC. This is dynasties 1 and 2. And so you can see a scene here of this battle for Lower Egypt. So now around 3100 BC, we have Egypt as the very first state because we have the unification of these two lands. Interestingly enough, it occurs right around the same time as a widespread adoption of irrigation agriculture. So again, you got to think about how the control of the water systems played into this. But now Egypt becomes, as a state, it also becomes a theocracy. So theocracy is a religious rule. The Egyptians believed that their king was a god. When he was alive, he was the personification of the god Horus. When he died, he became a personification of the god of the underworld, Osiris. And we're going to meet all of these guys later on. But they are now ruled by this religious rule. So they actually had no law codes because whatever the king said went, because it was his job to maintain the cosmic order, to maintain Ma'at. So if he told you to walk backwards naked, and they say, well, he knows what he's doing, we will do it. So everything was invested in this one individual. But that didn't mean that these 42 nomes completely disappeared. They were still ruled by governors. And these governors are going to become very powerful. So there are 42 governors who would then report to the pharaoh's right-hand man, known as the vizier, V-I-Z-I-E-R, the vizier, who would then report to the king. And that's how this huge bureaucracy worked. So they, of course, would need a capital city. And the capital city during the early dynastic period was the site of Memphis. You can see I've circled it on the map up there. So I got to put it right on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt to not favor one side or the other. And you can also see they have a new crown. So in the lower corner, you see the pictures of the crown. So they take the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt and combine it into one crown of all Egypt. And then again, the picture over there on the right shows the god Horus wearing the unified crown, and the guy on the right there is a mummified pharaoh. But remember that as he was living, he was considered to be Horus incarnate, and then when he would die, the pharaoh, he would become the king of the underworld, Osiris. So for example, Narmer would become Osiris Narmer. The capital city of Memphis no longer exists in terms of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic time period, but we do have some modern remains, and here's a picture I took there. My brother-in-law was always saying that on Facebook all I would do was post pictures of my dogs. I said, well, okay, I'll take pictures of other things, and so now I have pictures of ancient monuments with dogs. Another development during this time period of unification, so again around 3100 BC, was the development of the Egyptian system of writing. So hieroglyphs, which means sacred carvings. As the Egyptians called them, it was Medu Neter, which means divine words, because they believed that their writing system was a gift from a god, and the god is pictured there. It's the god Thoth, T-H-O-T-H. So they believed that he gave Egyptians this writing system. So these were from the gods, these divine words, and that these words were very powerful and magical. So any image, for example, of a snake or a bird could actually come alive and jump off the wall. So sometimes they would do just a little bit of damage to them. They might put a line between the snake or take off a little bit of the bird's wings so that they couldn't come alive and fly away. The Egyptians believed, very much like what we saw with the image magic, that as long as there was a picture of it, it actually happened. So we have pictures of kings who show them in battle. They were never actually in a battle, but as long as they have a picture of it on the walls, to them it actually happened. And the way to survive in the afterlife is to make sure that these images of you remained. So the Egyptians did a fair amount of damage to their own stuff when they would come to power, and if they didn't like the person who preceded them, they would go around hacking out the faces of their monuments because they thought that would destroy them in the afterlife. So again, the date for Egyptian hieroglyphs is 3100 BC, whereas the date for cuneiform is 3300 BC. But now you see, if we go back to that stuff that we found at Abydos and those ivory tags might be earlier. And so some would argue, oh no, Egyptian hieroglyphs is older than cuneiform. But for our purposes, cuneiform is the oldest, and then hieroglyphs show up around 3100 BC, again, as a gift from the gods. Unfortunately, the ability to read and write hieroglyphs was lost when Christianity came to the land and they tried to destroy everything that they considered pagan. It wasn't until during the time that Napoleon was in Egypt that this was uncovered. So this was about 1799, and they found up in Rosetta, it's called the Rosetta Stone. So it's this big chunk of stone that has the same thing, the same inscription, written in 3 different languages. One of them was Greek, which was still read and written and spoken at the time. Another one was hieroglyphs. So long story short, using the Greek and finding patterns in certain things, they were able to crack the code. So the Rosetta Stone was the key to translating hieroglyphs. And today we can read and write and sort of speak. The problem is they didn't use any vowels, so we don't really know how to vocalize the stuff. We've come up with our own rules, but we can at least read and write hieroglyphs thanks to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. All right, so that's what was going on. What you want to remember about the early dynastic period, again, is that's that first period of unification. That's when the actual state begins. That's when Egyptian writing appears. So we're trying to get Upper and Lower Egypt as one large state. And so now we move on to a time period known as the Old Kingdom. And we see it as a different time period, different cultural time period, because this is the time period that the pyramids were built. So it's called the Pyramid Age because of that. This was a period of remarkable stability and prosperity for the land. And so one thing the kings decided to do was build monumental architecture. And this was one way of consolidating their power. Remember that concept of conspicuous consumption, of showing off your wealth? But the other thing that this did was it helped institutionalize the state, because people became dependent on the state system. Because remember, this is built through corvée labor. So everybody knew that time of the year when the Nile was flooding and they couldn't work their land, they were going to come and work for the state, and they were going to build pyramids and tombs and temples. And so this kind of social network system was set up, and people probably thought, well, I don't need to worry about having a savings fund, things like that, because I know that I will be fed and clothed and housed during this time period. So you become dependent on the state. It's kind of similar to what we do as Americans. We know that, well, some of us at least know that Social Security would be around. Like, okay, well, I don't have to worry so much because that Social Security will be there, or I know if I'm out of work there will be unemployment benefits. But we become dependent on that state system, and that's what these rulers were trying to do, was convince the people that this bureaucracy needed to exist. So let's talk about the development of these pyramids. Didn't just happen overnight. This is the first step. This is known as the Step Pyramid of King Zoser. So it's on a site known as Saqqara. You don't need to write that down, but it's up again outside of Cairo today. So this is the first attempt at a pyramid, and this belongs to the 3rd dynasty. And so what you see here is a whole funerary complex. It's a mini city, a city to the dead. So that wall that you see there is a mile long, and then within it is the pyramid, temples, fake buildings that emulated his palace when he was alive. So again, it's this mini city. This is what the step pyramid looks like today. It looked a little nicer back in the day, but the nice sides of it have been robbed out for building material. And it's been closed for a few years as they had to stabilize part of it, and just actually reopened, and they removed all the scaffolding around it. So I was fortunate to be there when the scaffolding wasn't there and could take this picture. So it kind of looks like a wedding cake. And what they're doing is they're putting these structures on top of each other. Now, up until this point, the Egyptians had built in mud brick. This is the first monumental stone structure anywhere in the world. So they decided to build in stone and to build up instead of having these shallow pit graves. So this is part of the wall, and that's the entrance into the complex. And then the guys milling about are going to try and sell you a bunch of postcards and things like that. And all you have to say is La, which means no, and Imshi, which means go away. It's kind of rude, but for the females who are listening to this, you almost have to be like that. You got to be firm with these guys or they will follow you around and harass you. So we go in and we go through this colonnaded walkway. The Egyptians were the first to use columns. Now, notice the columns at this point are not freestanding, but they are the first columns. So we walk through, and then we open up into this open courtyard area. Now, these buildings that you're looking at are what we call dummy buildings. They're solid. You can't go in or out of them. But they were probably modeled off of the king's palace at Memphis. And while the king and everybody else physically cannot go in and out of these things, there is one thing that can, and that's the Ka, K-A. And the Ka, think of the Ka as kind of your spiritual double. The Ka is what exists in the afterlife. So while your physical mortal body may be gone, the Ka continues to exist as long as the body is preserved through mummification and as long as somebody hasn't destroyed all your pictures and monuments. So these dummy buildings are made for the Ka. So here's another view. We are now in the open courtyard. And here's the interior of the wall, and you should see those cobra heads up there. So those are to protect the sacred precinct, and they will spit their venom at any enemy that comes to attack the place. There's another view of the dummy buildings. And then another view of columns. So the Egyptians started using two types of columns, papyrus bundles and lotus blossoms. So these each represented Upper and Lower Egypt. So these are the lotus blossoms. Now back behind the step pyramid is something called a serdab, and this is this little room, and we're looking down into the serdab. So it's a little tiny building that had a statue, actually kind of a larger than life statue of the king. And then this is outside of it. And you can see that there are two little eye holes there. And so the priests on a regular basis, probably 2 to 3 times a day, would come and they would leave offerings before this serdab. And the statue of the god would ritually consume, or statue of the king, I should say, would ritually consume the food and the drink. And then after a little while, the priest would remove it, and that's what they would actually eat. So if you were to walk up into those little holes, this is what you're going to see. You're going to look in and see the statue of the king. Here's the real statue today in the Cairo Museum. Now again, back in the day, it was probably covered in a gold leaf, and it had precious stones in the eyes, but all of that was robbed away. But that is part of the this whole mortuary complex, because it's not like us where we might bury somebody and then we go away. Might visit them on a birthday or a special occasion. No, here in Egypt, you were tasked with a daily observance of making sure that the king had everything he would need or want in the afterlife. And so that's why there were these little, again, functioning cities with an entire priesthood that was assigned to these funerary complexes. And at some point, these funerary complexes would own a bunch of land, so they were kind of self-supporting. They could grow all of their own food, make all of their own funerary objects, and actually even sold a little bit of it to stay in business, kind of like how monasteries today might sell wine. So that was the first step. That was the step pyramid. Then we get to the Great Pyramids at Giza, the ones that you are probably familiar with. So these are 4th dynasty. And here's a drawing of them. So we've got 3 pyramids here at the site of Giza. Again, this is a plateau outside of Cairo. And the engineers actually flattened this thing out so that these pyramids are almost perfectly level. But again, it's an entire complex. It's not just these burial chambers, but there's a bunch of temples and smaller tombs and the Sphinx, all sorts of other things. So let's take a look at that. So here's a view, and you can see Cairo in the background with all of the pollution. So the biggest of the pyramids, oh yes, and here's my goofy picture that you always have to take when you're there. So there is me and my husband on the camels, again, the requisite picture you have to take. Anyway, the largest of the pyramids was built for this guy, King Khufu. So in Greek, it's known as Cheops, but we're talking Egyptian here, so it's Khufu. This is the largest pyramid. It's considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So this dude's about 481 feet high and about 756 feet long. It's 170 feet higher than the torch on the Statue of Liberty. Unfortunately, all that is left from Khufu is his pyramid and this little tiny ivory statue. It's about 2 inches big and it's in the museum. Everything else was robbed away in antiquity. This is a plan of the pyramid. This is the only pyramid that actually has the burial within it. Typically, they were used to cover the burial chambers, but for some reason, Khufu had a burial chamber within it. And you can see the layout here. Now, notice on the left-hand side where it says the Ali Mamun's Tunnel, that was the entranceway, and it's 50 feet off the ground. They hoped that that would deter any robbers. So you have to climb up 50 feet to get to that. Then you go up those ascending passages, the Grand Gallery, and then into the chamber. Unfortunately, it did not deter the robbers. They got in there and looted it out. So here is a picture of those stones. So that's my husband. He's about 5'8". He likes to think he's 5'9", but he's really 5'8". Just to give you an idea how big these things are. We're talking about stones that weigh about a ton each, so they are impressive. So you have to climb up those, and then you go in and you got to climb through this thing. And damn, is this thing hot in the summer. I don't think I have sweat as much as I have in this thing. It's like sheets of sweat coming off the back of my legs. And I almost collapsed when I got out of this thing because I was so dehydrated. But you have to climb up this thing, very narrow. So if you're claustrophobic, not a good thing, but it's pretty cool to get in there. And then once you're in, all you're going to see is the sarcophagus, this kind of bathtub stone structure that would have contained the coffin of the king, but again, has long since been robbed out. Along with Khufu and his pyramid was a full-sized boat that was buried next to it. This was probably the boat that took his body from the east side of the Nile, the land of the living, to the west side of the Nile, the land of the dead. So there's another duality concept there. And it does look like this boat was actually used. And it's now housed in its separate little climate-controlled building next to the pyramid. So you can go in and see that. There's another view so you can see the chamber on the boat there. So really, really interesting structure. So Khufu built the Great Pyramid. The second pyramid belongs to Khafre. So Khafre is the 4th king of the 4th dynasty, if you care. But he built the second one. It is slightly smaller. Now here's a statue of Khafre, and that is Horus behind him, holding him, right? Because remember, Horus is part of the kingship idea. So here's his pyramid. It's only 471 feet high, but he had it placed on slightly higher ground, so it looks a little bit larger. He's also responsible for the Sphinx. So the image carved on the Sphinx is the image of Khafre. And then the third pyramid, much smaller, belonged to Menkaure. He was the fifth king of the fourth dynasty. And we begin to see that the power of these kings is diminishing because his pyramid is actually getting smaller. And look at that poor little thing. It's only about a third of the size of the other two. And the only reason that you would do that is if you couldn't afford to do better. So it looks like these kings are running out of money at the time. So before we move on, let's talk about who built the pyramids. Right? There's been a lot of speculation that it was aliens who built it and that kind of stuff. Well, we're pretty sure that it was ancient Egyptians through corvée labor who built these pyramids. Now, one reason we know that is because we've actually found what we call the city of the pyramids, and that's what you're looking at here. This is the workman's city that's about a mile away from the pyramids, and this is where all the workers lived. There was a year-round force, but then it would swell during the flooding season as all the workers would come in for that temporary corvée labor. We have in the burials of the overseers, where they've talked about overseers of the workers of the Great Pyramids. In the pyramids themselves, we found hieroglyphs on the stones that say, for example, the Gang of Khufu. So it looks like we had different working groups in there. So all of this supports the idea that these pyramids, again, were not built by any sort of slave labor. These were actual Egyptians, not Hebrew slaves, not slaves at all, but Egyptians working through the corvée labor. How did they do it? Well, we think that they probably built some sort of earthen ramps that would circle the pyramids, and they have shown that you can pull a 2.5-ton block. 12 men could easily pull that with wooden pulleys underneath it and wetting the sand. And so you can see here they would just pull it up and set it into place. And the city of the pyramids shows that they had a workforce large enough to actually do this. You would need about 1,200 men a day to get 120 stones over to the construction site in order to build this thing in about 20 years. So again, all of it supports this idea that it was easily done by native Egyptians. So what happened to our old kingdom? Well, there was a gradual decline in royal authority over about the next 300 years. And it appears that one of the problems was the building of these pyramids simply bankrupted the state. They were spending more than they were bringing in. Another problem were these governors out in these old 42 nomes, and they were becoming very powerful. They were really far from the court. They were the ones responsible for collecting the taxes and the tribute. They probably skimmed a little bit off the top. Then we see a period of about 30 years where there was no flooding. So there was a time period that might have been a little bit of famine. And so the king was discredited, basically. And we see a collapse of centralized power. And this opens up what's known as the First Intermediate Time Period. And this is a time period that lasts for about 120 years. We now have independent nomes with their own little local rulers. We have famine, we have disorder, we have tombs being destroyed, looted. But the thing that comes out of here, and the one thing that I want you to remember, is some new religious views. The Egyptians are the first to have a concept of a final judgment. The idea that how you behave in this world will impact how you exist in the afterlife, or even whether you get in or not. And the scene that you're looking at on the screen, and we will revisit this again when we get to religion, but this is the final judgment. So you have to be free of a certain amount of sins in order to be given admission into the afterlife. They also democratize the afterlife. So up to this time period, it was really only the kings and the queens who could get into the afterlife. Well, now they're going to let anybody in, as long as you can prove you were a good person. Now, why are they doing this during this time period? This is a social control mechanism. You've got recession, highway robbery, murder, all sorts of bad things. How do you get the people under control? Well, you promise them something and you say, I know that life sucks right now, but as long as you behave, you're going to get into the afterlife. You're going to get into this wonderful place and you're going to live like a king and a god. So it was a way of trying to control the population and get them to behave. So again, this concept of the final judgment emerges in this first intermediate period as a social control mechanism. But the Egyptians are the first to have this concept. And then, as we know, other religious systems will take on that idea that that there's a heaven and a hell, basically, and how you behave in this life will make that decision for you. So again, the first intermediate period lasts for about 120 years. Finally, they're able to get things back together. So at the end of the first intermediate period, there are several families that are ruling for control of the throne. And there was a king from the city of Thebes, and I've just circled it on the screen for you, who was able to reunify Egypt around 2040 BC and open up what's known as the Middle Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom, then, the capital is now moved to Thebes. The economy starts chugging again. Trade is revived with Palestine, with the Aegean. They even expand their borders south into what is Nubia. But there was a lot of extensive building projects again. And because of that, there was an influx of foreign laborers, and they're coming in from Syria, Palestine, and they are settling up in the Delta region. Let me see if I've circled it here. Yeah. So they're settling at the sites of Avaris and Tanis. So they're coming across from, you can see here from Gaza, that area, across the Sinai, and they are settling in the Delta region. So again, they're mostly foreign laborers at this time period. But what we see is another collapse of power. We're going to enter into the second intermediate period. Fragmentation of rulers, and these people who have been moving in, settling up in Avaris, they see an opportunity. They see a power vacuum, and they take control of the Delta region. They basically take control of Lower Egypt. Remember, these are foreigners. So this is the first time in Egyptian history that foreigners have ruled the land. And these foreigners are known as Hyksos. So here are some images from tombs of the Hyksos moving in. And again, they were moving in as laborers. They were bringing some technology to the Egyptians. But once they saw this power vacuum, they decided to take advantage of it. So the Hyksos take control of Lower Egypt. So they're ruling from Avaris. And this was just horrible for the Egyptians to have a foreigner on the throne. And there's one inscription that says, foreigners have become people everywhere, saying basically now they're Egyptians. How can this be? But the thing is that the Hyksos were actually really good for the Egyptians. They didn't see it, but they're really good because what they did was they introduced to Egypt a lot of really impressive things. For example, they introduced bronze to the Egyptians. Egyptians up till this time period were only using copper. They had no concept of bronze. The Hyksos introduced that to them. They also introduced this stuff. So the Hyksos had wheels, they had chariots, they had body armor, they had a composite bow. All of these wonderful weapons of war they introduced to the Egyptians. Now, what do you think the Egyptians are going to do with that? Well, yeah, they're going to turn it around and use it against them. And that's exactly what they would do. So here is, we're going to end on this scene because we're going to pick up the story in the next presentation. And look at that, we're at 1 hour, 8 minutes, so just about a class time lecture. So perfect. But here is a scene that we're going to see as we open up the next time period, the New Kingdom, of all of this stuff, the chariots, the wheels, the body armor, as the Egyptians begin to push these damn Hyksos Hyksos out of their land and into or back into Syria, Palestine. And that's what's going to happen as they close out the second intermediate period, and we're going to open up the new kingdom, and that's where we will pick up the lecture in the next one. But so remember, the second intermediate period is the time period that we have the first foreigners, the Hyksos, coming in and controlling part of Egypt, but that they actually pulled the Egyptians kicking and screaming into the Bronze Age by introducing bronze, the wheel, the chariot, body armor, a composite bow, all of that kind of stuff. But eventually, again, the Egyptians will use that, and the rulers of Thebes will be able to get enough forces together to attack Avaris and push them out of Egypt back into Syria, Palestine.